This edition of the Ridley Report is brought to you by
porcfest.com.
Dave Ridley here, checking in for ridleyreport.com with a couple of observations about the Ron Paul situation. I catch a little bit of heat sometimes within the liberty movement because I'm something of a fan of Winston Churchill. Well, maybe I'll catch even more while I'm at it. There are actually some interesting parallels between Dr. Paul's situation and Winston Churchill's situation in the 1930s. Churchill was a kind of guy who could generally predict what was about to happen, and he was able to accurately predict what would happen with the Nazis, what would happen in the late 30s and the early 40s and so forth. And in a way, Dr. Paul is like that. And they are both persecuted for being people who are able to see the bad thing that is coming. But in the same way, each of them has sort of been ostracized from power. Churchill was, of course, higher up in the system and pushed almost completely out of power. In fact, I think he may have even been pushed out of his parliament seat, or at least thrown out of the Conservative Party, something like that, before World War II started. And there's an advantage to being in this position. It means that you don't bear any of the responsibility for what happens. If Churchill had managed to get up into the government before all the trouble started, into the higher echelons of the government, he would have been blamed for much of what happened after being in power for a year or two or whatnot. For instance, if he'd been Secretary of the Treasury or involved in the First Lord of the Admiralty or something like that, he would have borne the blame for much of what happened in the early parts of World War II. But as it was, he was so far from power, he was also far from blame. And I think to some extent that's what's going to happen with Dr. Paul. And if we look backwards to the things that happened after things really started to go wrong in the late 1930s for the British, if we look into that situation, maybe we can, by looking at that situation, we may be able to see a little bit about what's happening or what's going to happen next in the United States. But the way it all worked out, as things really started to go wrong with Munich and so forth, with Hitler, people started to remember all the things that Churchill had been saying, things they might have made fun of at the time. They started to realize that he was right. And the question for me is, did Dr. Paul get that message out to enough people so that they remember it in a year or two when the bottom has perhaps fallen out of the economy? Start remembering the causes that he was listing, the warnings that he was making. Will they remember to the same extent that people in England remembered what Churchill had said?
The need for this spirit of America.
Dr. Paul keeps saying it over and over again. We have a currency that they're printing too much of. They're spending too much money. It's going to create this problem and that problem, I think mainly pointing to inflation or hyperinflation. When those things happen, hopefully a majority of Americans will realize that Dr. Paul was predicting them and that he was right. Certainly, I don't think that Dr. Paul has the same kind of bully pulpit in the United States that Churchill had in mid-30s England. But again, the parallel is there. I think it's a constructive parallel. It could bode well for our message as the bottom begins to fall out. We'll just see what happens. This is Dave Ridley, about to sign off for ridleyreport.com. But first,
Did you enjoy the 2008 New Hampshire Liberty Forum? Would you like a cheaper, more social opportunity to see New Hampshire and meet the porcupines? Well, now's the time to make plans for PorcFest '08. We're holding it at Gunstock Mountain Resort, June 9th through the 15th. We'll be doing a lot of this, and a lot of this. When it's over, you'll know whether New Hampshire and the Free State Project are for you. However, Laconia Bike Week starts the week of the 14th, so campsites and hotels will likely sell out. Make your reservations today. Details are at porcfest.com under the lodging section.